بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله حمدا شاكرين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. It is really a pleasure of myself to be in the company of such esteemed people as yourselves on this visual space that we have for this short time that we have together. It is, of course, something that's with a heavy-heartedness that we approach this topic because of the current events. What's happening has been happening, in fact, in Palestine for so many decades. What we're seeing, in fact, we have seen in Sheikh Jarrah was only a microcosm of a macrocosm of an occupation, of apartheid, of settler colonialism. The purpose, inshallah, of my talk today, in fact, is to think and deliberate about the historical, not so much the context, but the precedent of an occupation of Palestine. One of the starting points for our discussion, inshallah, is going to begin not so much with Jerusalem, but going back to Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, that it was that the Muslims of Al-Andalus by the 11th century had begun to divide into smaller states, autonomous entities. This became known as the Muluk al-Tawa'if, the party kingdoms. And so those great states of Al-Andalus that were once beacons of great hope and inspiration and now become smaller states with independent rulers and independent, forces. When this happened, the Christian states of the north, also of Navarre and Castile and Aragon and also of the Christians of the northern frontiers in the mountains of Galicia and Asturias, backed, of course, by the Christians further north from France, the Catholic Church began to finance the Christians, and what happened is that the Muslims, in their state of weakness and division, began to become taken advantage of, by the Christians of these states, and so popes like Alexander III and Gregory VII were the first ones, in fact, to proclaim what's called an indulgence, calling the Christians to make this what became known as a crusade into Al-Andalus, into Spain, to fight back and push back against them and to defend the churches and take back the states of Tarragona, for example. One of the papal bulls was called the Clairvolt at Nancy, and these were papal bulls that granted Christians an indulgence. Indulgence was a promise of remission of sins, forgiveness of sins, and entrance into heaven if they partook in these battles, and if they died there, then it's even better for them. And so this idea kind of, was the same idea that was used by the Pope Urban II in Clermont in France, when he pronounced what came to be known as a crusade. Now, there are, of course, different reasons why this happened. One of them was the fact that the Seljuk Muslims were making advances against the Byzantines. You had the Battle of Manzikert in 1074 with Alp Arsalan. And so the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus writes a letter to Pope Urban II asking for assistance. And remember, of course, that there is a schism. There is a schism between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. But in spite of that schism, Urban II is still calling on the Christian world, the faithful, to help and rescue your Eastern brothers, and that was one thing. So the other thing, of course, was that there was an incident took place in the early part of the 11th century, and that was, or the 10th century, sorry, and that was the Fatimid Shia Khalif al-Hakam bi-Amr Allah destroyed a part of the Holy Sepulchre. The Christians believe that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the most celebrated, the most venerated church on earth. They believe that's where Jesus Christ was buried and resurrected from. Of course, that's their belief, not our belief, but it's their belief. And therefore, they believe that church is the most important church in the world. And so therefore, the vocabulary of the Crusader speeches of Urban II was very much about rescuing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, rescuing Jerusalem, and fighting back against the Muslims. Now, this, of course, was also enveloped with a lot of dehumanizing language against the Muslims. Remember, of course, that there were no Muslims living in Western Europe at that time. Therefore, they didn't have access to information. They didn't know much about the Muslims, except what they would encounter from them in their pilgrim travels, down to Jerusalem. But they began to, concoct these characterized images of the Muslims, and Urban II's surviving speeches are a reflection of this, that Muslims are barbaric, are heathen, are savages. They sacrifice babies at the altar. they worship Muhammad, so I mean, all these kind of crazy things. And so and also the fact that he's speaking to a population who are in need of remission of sins. They're in need of forgiveness because they've been fighting against one another. And Urban's message was, why don't you turn your weapons against the Muslims as opposed to turning them against one another? They're in need of forgiveness because they're adulterers or they're brigands and they're thieves and murderers. And therefore, it was a kind of an opportunity for them to achieve salvation, through by responding to this call of what came to be known as a crusade. They became known as Peregrini Militari Christi, as pilgrim knights of Christ. And so they had to travel with the pilgrim purse and with the pilgrim staff on this mission. And then, of course, they traveled. They left from in 1095 when the speeches were made. They arrived in 1099. En route, many things happened. There was in 1096 the massacre in the Rhineland, where they massacred Jews on way, because some people believe that it's better off fighting the enemy that's closer to us, meaning the Jews, rather than fighting the distant enemy of the Muslims. By the time they got to al-Quds, al-Sharif, Jerusalem, in 1099, they were really whipped up with a sense of frenzy about really destroying and just creating a pillage and a massacre, which is what happened. In accounts of the Jester Francorum, Albert of Aachen, and others, the proclamation of the Crusaders was Dus Vult, which meant God wills it, God wills it. This slogan was also the slogan of the Grand Inquisitor in the Spanish Inquisition, Thomas de Torquemada. In Spanish, Dus Vult is Dios la quiere, meaning God wills it, God wills it. So therefore, they're seeking some kind of biblical, religious validation for what they're about to do and what they're doing, which is to commit complete massacre in the city of Jerusalem. In the account of Ibn al-Athir, about 70,000 Muslims were killed in the city of Jerusalem, men, women, children. In the account of Albert of Aachen, it even says that they would swing the babies and smash their heads against the walls, proclaiming, Dus Vult, God wills it, God wills it. And so terrible, terrible massacre took place. That was the first time that Muslims lose the city of Jerusalem to the Crusaders. And that, of course, is the third most holy sanctity for the Muslims, the Masjid al-Aqsa. And al-Quds itself is a venerated city in Islam, of course. Many verses in the Quran point to al-Quds, its relevance, its significance. It's a land of prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a land where great prophets of Allah, Ibrahim alayhi salam, settled. Sulaiman alayhi salam had his empire kingdom there. Dawood alayhi salam, the father of Sulaiman alayhi salam, was there. Lut alayhi salam, وَنَجَّيْنَاهُ وَلُوطًا إِلَى الْأَرْضِ الَّتِي بَارَكْنَا فِيهَا. Allah says we sent Lut and Ibrahim there. Allah said that وَلِسُلَيْمَانَ الرِّيحَ عَاصِفَةً تَجْرِي بِأَمْرِهِ إِلَى الْأَرْضِ الَّتِي بَارَكْنَا فِيهَا. That with Sulaiman was the heavy strong wind that went with him to the land that Allah had blessed, meaning Beit al-Maqdis, Jerusalem. It's a land that Allah speaks about in the most magnificent way in the opening verse of Surah Al-Isra, and this is perhaps the most important connection we have to Beit al-Maqdis, and that is that on that very difficult time in the Prophet's life, sallallahu, during what's called the Amul Huzn, the year of grief, when his blessed wife Khadija passes away, radiallahu anha, and Abu Talib also passes away, these supports for him, were now gone. And then the travesty of Ta'if takes place, the hardest day in the Prophet's life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then Allah took him on the miraculous night journey from Makkah to al-Mukarramah to Masjid al-Aqsa. And Allah says, subhanahu wa ta'ala, Subhanalladhi asra bi'abdihi laylam min al-Masjid al-Harami ila al-Masjid al-Aqsa alladhi barakna hawlahu linuriyahu min ayatina. And then the verse continues that glory be to him who took his servant by night from Masjid al-Haram in Mecca to Masjid al-Aqsa in Beit al-Maqdis, whose precincts we have blessed to show him some of our signs. And this was the most magnificent event in the Prophet's life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that Allah took him from Mecca, from the Kaaba to Masjid al-Aqsa, really establishes for us the great significance of that landscape. And it was, of course, from there that he then, rose to the heavens and communicated with Allah and received instructions, so on and so forth. And it's from that location that he led all of the prophets in salah and prayer. It was so magnificent. Abdullah ibn Abbas says, says that there was not an inch of Al-Aqsa where an angel has not stood, and nor an inch in Al-Aqsa where a prophet has not prayed. And so therefore the whole territory, and by the way, Al-Aqsa is not just Masjid Qibli, it's the whole Aqsa compound between the walls of Suleiman. Everything there is Al-Aqsa. Dome of the Rock is Al-Aqsa. Masjid Qibli is Aqsa. All of that area, in fact, for us is Masjid Al-Aqsa. And a masjid, of course, is a place of sajda, it's a place of prostration. And all of that landscape, therefore, for us is Masjid Al-Aqsa. So therefore, it was a travesty. Now, I want to speak about the fact that the first responses to that first crusade came, in fact, from not from the political body of the Muslims, who, in fact, were, I mean, you could say they were in their own quagmire because of great divisions between them. I say that, but I would also say before I say that there was a particular year called the year of the death of the caliphs, and this is around maybe 5 or 6 years before the Crusaders arrived. In that particular year, the Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah dies, his Wazir Nizam al-Mulk dies, the Fatimid Khalif the next year dies, his Wazir dies, the Sunni Khalif al-Mustansir Billah, he also dies. So 5 deaths in a space of a year, which would have destabilized, the political unity of the Muslims, and the morale of the Muslims would have been affected by that. I don't know if the Crusaders had known this, but in any case, of course, they would have used that to their advantage. Second to that, of course, there were divisions in the Seljuks as well, that when Jerusalem was being besieged in 1099, the 2 sons of Malik Shah were fighting against one another. You had a Sunni Shia divide as well, which of course complicated things as well. So therefore, there was division. And so the first responses were not so much political responses, but they were responses, from the population of Asham. The first, in fact, scholarly response we have on record is by a man called Ali ibn Tahir al-Sulami, who was a Shafi'i faqih in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, who authored a text called Kitab al-Jihad, the Book of Jihad. And in it, he's calling upon the Muslim world to unify themselves, calling upon the Khalif, the Abbasid Khalif, to respond to this, calling upon the Muslims to fix up, and it's a remarkable text in the fact that it survived for us, in different parts, and there were public readings as well, of that book on different days, because it's quite a long text, but it's a text that survives. Now, the response to that text was not much, because, and even those who attended the gatherings to listen to the text were not that many either. We know that because we have the surviving documents of the of those who were in attendance in his public gatherings still preserved today. And the other responses were responses that came from poets. So my work, my doctorate, my PhD is very much focused on the poetry of that period. The first poetic responses came from poets like Abu Muzaffar al-Abi-Wardi, Ibn al-Khayrat, and we also have an anonymous poet as well. Al-Abi-Wardi's lines are very evocative. وكيف تنام العين ملء جفونها على هفوات أيقظت كل نائم وإخوانكم بالشام يضحي مقيلهم ظهور المذاكي وبطن القشائم. And the poem goes on. He says, how can the eyes sleep at a time like this that would awaken any sleeper, when your brothers are sleeping, when your brothers in Sham are sleeping in the bellies of vultures? And so this poem was memorized and learnt, and was recited in an act of defiance, and I think it was 1101, when the Shafi'i faqih of Damascus, Abu Sa'id al-Harawi, travels with a contingent to Baghdad, to the power base of the Khalif, and recites this poem that even broke the minbar on that occasion to alert the Muslims of Baghdad about what's just happened in Asham, in Jerusalem. But still, it didn't have much of an effect. No one responded to that. And by this time, of course, the Crusaders are establishing a kingdom called the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now, for the first decades, of that kingdom, and from the first decades since 1099, the situation would remain, quite. I mean, there wasn't a real although there were some attempts, in fact, even the Fatimids sent an expedition, in fact, but politically the situation was not, it wasn't right, really for the Muslims to make any offensive that could potentially recapture Jerusalem, from the Crusaders. The Crusaders, of course, taking also the coastlines, Acre, Ascalon, Tyre, Beirut. Sidon, all of these are also taken by the Crusaders. It's not just about Jerusalem, it's also the coastline as well. And so Muslim world therefore finds itself for the first time in its history where the third most important Masjid al-Aqsa is under occupation, and Jerusalem, that sanctified city, is also occupied by the Crusaders. And real changes would take place really in the 1140s, 1144 particularly, when you had the Zengid ruler Imad ad-Din Zengi, who takes back a Crusader state called the state of Edessa. And this really transformed then the morale of the Muslims, because it allowed them to see that perhaps victory in Jerusalem might be possible after all. So there was a victory, therefore it kind of inspired the poets to now focus their efforts on speaking about reconquest. There was a sense of a new spirit, in the Muslim camp, but it would not be Imad ad-Din Zengi who would carry that through. It would be his son, Nur ad-Din Zengi, who would carry that through. He really becomes this archetypal, paradigmatic jihad ruler, a model really of jihad resistance. You had an expectation that the Muslim rulers would live by standards. You had certain texts being written. Al-Ghazali wrote one of them, Nasiyat al-Muluk. You had another one, anonymous one in Persian, Bahr al-Fawaid. And these texts were about giving instructions to rulers, to sultans and emirs about the correct code of conduct and piety that they should uphold. And so Nur ad-Din Zengi really fit that model. One of the poets said about him, he was ذُو الجهادين من عدو ونفس فهو طول الحياة في هجائي, that he was the one who embodied two jihads, one against himself, one against the enemy, and therefore his entire life therefore is in struggle. And there's many different interesting things about him, what the chroniclers and the poets say about him, that he was a man who was he was frugal, he was a man who upheld justice and codes of honor and justice. He was somebody who was very good in administration, his building programs. So Nur ad-Din, he kind of had 3 points, you might say 3-point plan about how to revive the Muslim world at that time. One was based upon what my thesis, in fact, was on, a large part of it, which was about the books of Fada'il al-Quds, which were the books of the merits of Jerusalem, the virtues of Jerusalem. Now, there are, of course, like I mentioned some of them, the virtues of Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa, for example, but there was a literature. So the idea was that in this century, when Al-Quds is now taken by the Crusaders, what needs to be done to re-inspire in the hearts of the Muslims this sense of yearning for traveling to, settling in, fighting for Jerusalem. And so they made use of this literature, became really, really important. And they brought back old books, like the books of Al-Raba'i was one of them. Al-Wasiti was another one, older books. And then there were new publications like As-Sama'ani, and there were others also. Ibn Asakir's Tarikh Dimashq, the opening section of it is very much about the Fada'il of Ash-Sham. And remember, Ash-Sham is really the center point of Ash-Sham is Jerusalem, is Beit al-Maqdis. So when the Prophet says, for example, Tuba li-Sham, Tuba li-Sham, Tuba li-Sham, blessings upon Sham, and Sham 3 times you mentioned it. And they said, what is that for, Ya Rasulullah? And he said, Tilka malaikatullah, those are the angels of Allah that wrap their wings around Ash-Sham. He said, Alaykum bi-Sham, upon you to go to Ash-Sham. He said, Allahumma barik lana fi Shamin wa fi Yemen. Allah bless us in our Sham and our Yemen. And so many hadith about the virtues of Ash-Sham as a location of Damascus and in Beit al-Maqdis, Jerusalem, and so on and so forth. And so the Muslims, began to make use of these hadith, and teach these in their schools of learning. Now, about schools of learning, so in the internal states of Syria, of Hama and Homs and Baalbek and Damascus, there was a madrasa building program. These were the Nizamiya madrasas, named after Nizam al-Mulk, who was a patron. And in these schools of learning, they began to teach these books of hadith, of Fada'il al-Quds, and this became really quite a popular trend at that time. And that was one of the focus areas of Nuruddin Zengi, to make that a focal point. Other thing, of course, in practical terms, you realize it's very difficult because Sham, Syria itself, was divided between Aleppo and Damascus, and so he realized that it wouldn't be very likely to have success against the Crusaders if we ourselves are divided in Syria, and if we made it a really priority for himself to unify these two states of Aleppo and Damascus. And he did that in his life. In fact, he came into Damascus to do that himself. And that even within Damascus, the madrasa building program continues. So therefore, when he arrives, there were 11 madrasas, and when he dies, 1174, there were 22. So he's doubled it, by the time he died, 1174. In his character, he really exemplifies this model of a jihad leader, as someone who's very pious, pious and concerned about Allah and Akhirah and so on and so forth. He would encourage his troops to pray in the night, for example, to make a lot of dua. He would give stipends to even the poor ones and even the elderly, so that they could make dua for the Muslims, who are in the battlefield. He was someone who would listen to the needs and the concerns of his people. In one very famous account, it says that a poet approached him and he says to him, Nuruddin, because Nuruddin used to charge high taxes, and he says to Nuruddin in his line, he says, Ya Nuruddin, ماذا تقول إذا وقفت بموقف فردا ذليلا والحساب عسير وتعلقت فيما الخصوم وأنت في يوم الحساب مسلسل مجرور وتفرقت عنك الجنود وأنت في ضيق القبور موسد مقبور مهد لنفسك هج تنجو بها يوم المعاد ويوم تبدل الأور. Nuruddin, what would you say? What would you do when you're standing before Allah and your accountability will be hard on that day? What would you do, Nuruddin, if you're in the depths of your grave and your enemy has deserted you? What are you going to do? He said at the end, prepare for yourself an excuse before Allah on a day when things will be difficult for you in your accountability. And Nuruddin immediately lowered the taxes when he heard these lines recited to him. Therefore, he had that sense of, a piety and pietistic concern. Nuruddin, therefore, was instrumental. Therefore, the second objective he had was a realization that there are internal enemies in the Muslim Ummah, and the most obvious for them would have been the Fatimids of Egypt. Now, initially interesting because even many of these rulers, the Sunni ones, in fact, ended up working for the Fatimids as wazirs and so on and so forth. I mean, Egypt was really a powerhouse, a power base. Whoever had control of Egypt, and particularly the ports of Damietta, for example, would have control potentially of Jerusalem. And so he realized that. And so, but then there came a time where the Fatimid dynasty was allying with the Crusaders against the Muslims. Initially, in fact, he even sent Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi and his uncle Shawar to go reinstate the Fatimid and his uncle Shirku to reinstate Shawar, the Fatimid wazir. But then when it came to surface that they were really backstabbing them, with the help of the Crusaders, then it was the idea that you're going to defeat them now. And then the last Khalifa al-Adil died in 1171, and that was the end of Egypt as a Shia power, and it became Sunni, thereafter. But that was a realization that you're going to have internal enemies, and you have to isolate them. They cannot be trusted. And then number three, the focus on recapturing Jerusalem. He did something quite interesting, which is that he built a minbar. He has this minbar built, which is a masterpiece, really. It's a really magnificent minbar. And it was built, with no nuts, no bolts, all interlocking parts. And then he says, we will station this in Aleppo. And when we recapture Jerusalem, we will bring it down, and we will have our first, Salah in Al-Aqsa. And he didn't live to see that because he died 1174. And that's going to be 13 years before Al-Quds is recaptured. But it still inspired a sense of hope in the Muslim camp that perhaps one day we will, in fact, recapture Jerusalem. And he became, quite a model inspiration leader. And there's so much more to say about him, but Then, of course, the leader who really was raised in the schools of Nuruddin, in the atmosphere, environment of Nuruddin, of course, was Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. Now, we're dealing with two different dynasties, really, because the Ayyubis and the Zengis were sometimes, in fact, at with war with one another. But it was quite interesting, in fact, what made their union so interesting was that, you had a particular. So when Salahuddin was born 1137, he was born on the day that his father Najmuddin Ayyub and his uncle Shirku were expelled from Kerak, sorry, from Tikrit, because of some injustice committed against a Christian scribe, and then the one who hosted them was Imaduddin Zengi himself, and he was in fact repaying a favor. It's a longer story, but he's repaying a favor back to him. And so therefore, Salah ad-Din as a young boy has the privilege of being raised in this environment of piety, of war as well, and he's learning about about battles when it's from a very young age, and he's making use of that environment, so that therefore by the time he gets older, then Nuruddin would of course use him, to as be like a general, in the armies. When Nuruddin dies in 774, Salah ad-Din then becomes the ruler of Egypt and of Asham as well. And then from this point onwards, really the focus is very much on the recapturing of Beit al-Maqdis, of Jerusalem. The policies of Nuruddin are only strengthened under Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. There are many campaigns he has against other Muslims as well, oftentimes rebellious groups, to suppress those rebellions. But also his agenda was to focus his efforts on dealing with the Crusaders, and this was really a big thing for him. Salah ad-Din, again, in his personality, exemplified this spirit of Islamic piety and of justice and so on and so forth, like Nuruddin Zengi before him. And so by this time, of course, Al-Aqsa has been turned into like a stable for horses. And so the Dome of the Rock is now like a chapel for the Christians. Um, and the power base of the Crusaders is growing because you have a continuity of kings. You have new settlements, from the Europeans who are traveling down to Jerusalem and are settling there. And the Muslim world, of course, is dealing with its own issues, but there is now a feeling of change, in the Muslim camp. Feeling of change in the Muslim camp. And so Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, I mean, one of his great roles really was kind of as a general, really. And because what he does is that he is able to use his administration, particularly really intelligent people like Al-Qadi Al-Fadil and others as well around him, and their purpose was to really send these letters to other parts of the Muslim world to bring in different troops and different skilled people into the Sham, and they would then form part of his army. So therefore, his army was now growing in strength from the Hijaz, from Iraq, from Syria, from Sham, and all of these areas they're coming together. And so Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, therefore, by the time we get to 1180s, he's in a strong position. 1183, a big event takes place, which was the Red Sea incursion of Reynold de Chatillon, one of the Crusader princes of Karak, and he, in fact, even took his army by sea all the way to the Hijaz. They were very close to Medina to Munawwara, and he had some very evil intentions about when he gets to Medina Munawwara. And so Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, he sent his naval expert Hussam ad-Din Lu'lu', to prevent that happening, and it was successful, and he was celebrated in the Muslim world. And so Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi therefore becomes this kind of very archetypal jihad leader. He was someone very concerned about Jerusalem, al-Quds. He would say things like وَكَيْفَ يَطِيبُ لِي الْفَرَحْ وَالطَّعَامِ وَلَذَّةُ الْمَنَامِ وَبَيْتُ الْمَقْدِسِ بِيَدِ الصَّلِيبِيِّينَ. How would it please me to eat food and have nice drink when Jerusalem is in the hands of the Crusaders? They would say about him that كَانَ كَالْوَالِدَ الثَّقْلَةِ. he was like a bereaved mother. They would say, like, he would say things like, like he would, go on his horse throughout the streets and say, "Wayunadi ya lil Islam," and he would call upon, "Oh Islam." And so he had a really deep-seated concern and care for Jerusalem, and the fact that that was in Crusader hands was unacceptable for him. And so therefore he used his his efforts to re-inspire the return of Jerusalem, with the armies that he had gathered together from different parts of the Muslim world, and exemplified within his character a sense of justice, a sense of doing good to people. There are really beautiful accounts, in fact, of Salah ad-Din. There's his biographer Ibn Shaddad, for example, once relates that, I think this was in I think it might have been in Antioch, maybe, that one Crusader, one Christian woman, had her child stolen from her tent or from her place, and then, of course, as any mother would be, is completely distraught and comes out and starts banging on the floor and crying out and saying, "What was my child?" And she gets permission from her Christian princes, if she's able to approach Salah ad-Din for assistance. And then even they acknowledge that, of course, he's a righteous person, that he can be approached. And then she approaches him and asks him for help. And Salah ad-Din, in Ibn Ashadad's account, it says that that the woman and Salah ad-Din are standing together and they're both weeping, they're both crying, because of what's happened. And he gave money to the people to go and find this child, and the child was brought back, and she was so thankful and appreciative and so happy with that. Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, therefore, by the time we get to late 1180s, the most climactic moment in his life would be during a battle called the Battle of Hittin, 1187. This is when Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi and his army are, what was happened is that the Prince of Karak, Reynold de Chatillon, has broken the treaty that was between Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi and Raymond of Tripoli, another Christian prince. He broke the treaty by attacking a Muslim pilgrim caravan, and plundering it and attacking the Muslim pilgrims. And so Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, therefore, he had no need to renew the treaty because his army was so strong by this time it could defeat the Christian Crusader armies. And so what he does is that he takes his troops to Tiberias, and they stay in Tiberias. The Crusaders, in fact, are on the other end, on the west, which is Safaria. And in Safaria is where all the Crusaders are there. In fact, the Knights Templars, the Hospitallers, the King of Jerusalem, King Guy de Lusignan is there as well. And even the head of the Knights Templars, Gerard de Rightfoot, is there, and Raymond of Tripoli is there. They're all there. And they have access to a water source, which is Safaria itself. But what happens is when the Muslims are in Tiberias, they discover that one of the castles is actually being protected by the wife of Raymond of Tripoli, right? They come to realize this, and so it was a big thing because now they have this as leverage, you see. And so when this news reaches the Crusader camp on the west, they thought, well, what's going to happen now? Raymond of Tripoli, interesting, the husband of Ashiva, the wife of who's there stuck in Tiberias, knows that Salah ad-Din would never attack a woman, that he would never do that. He knew that himself. But Reynold de Chatillon, this troublemaker, from Karakud, who destroyed the caravan of the pilgrims, and the head of the Knights Templars, Gerard de Rightfoot, because he has some envy and some rivalry with Raymond of Tripoli, both of these convinced the king of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan, that they have to march out and attack the Muslims in Tiberias. It was a fundamental error, fundamental flaw, because we're dealing with the midsummer in the month of July, and it's so hot, and if they leave their water supply, then it's going to be troublesome, of course, for the horses and for the men as well, and in the heat of the day. But in any case, they made that move. Salah ad-Din remained where he was in Tiberias, and they have a big water supply in Tiberias. And as they're marching forth, they're taken down into a valley called the Horns of Hattin, and it's there. Therefore, the Crusaders are confounded. Salah ad-Din lights these bushfires, and the fire and the ashes and the smoke is traveling towards them. It's very, very hot, and they're exhausted, and they're in a bad state, and it became one of the most greatest victory, for the Muslims at that time. Athir says it was the greatest victory in the Battle of Qadisiyah, the Battle of Hittin. Imad al-Isfahani, his biographer, said that the number of prisoners were so many we wouldn't believe anybody had died, and numbers of those who were killed were so many we wouldn't believe anybody had been taken prisoner. So it was a very big victory for the Muslims, and everybody was captured. The king was captured, and Reynold himself was captured as well, and Knights Templars were all captured. And as he promised, Salah ad-Din promised not to spare the Knights Templars because of the great damage they do to the Muslims, and they were all executed. And likewise, the Reynold de Chatillon, Prince of Carrick, was also executed as well. Now, this became the most important victory for the Muslims, since the loss of Jerusalem in 1099, and it really paved the way now for the possibility. In fact, it was now very inevitable that he would, of course, march to Jerusalem. But of course, you also had the coastline to deal with as well. And he sent some people, to those areas. But his heart was, of course, about recapturing Beit al-Maqdis, recapturing Jerusalem. And so, and that's exactly where he went. And so he arrives in Jerusalem in the month of Rajab, and it was coincided with 27th of Rajab, which many believe to be the Prophet's night journey. And it was on that day, on what many believe to be the Prophet's night journey, that Salah ad-Din arrives in Jerusalem. Again, the sense of magnanimity in Salah ad-Din's character is really at the core, you might say, because there is one of the Crusader knights, Balin of Ibelin, in fact, who took part and participated in Battle of Hittin against the Muslims. He has a wife in Jerusalem, Maria Comnenus. She's there with her children, and he has to get to her before Salah ad-Din does. And so he's writing back, but he sends this dispatch to Salah ad-Din asking for permission that if he could get to Jerusalem and take out the wife and the kids, would that be okay? And Salah ad-Din says it would be okay on the condition that you don't raise up arms against Muslims ever again. And so therefore he gets back. But when he gets back, there's no king because he's just been captured in the Battle of Hittin. And so the patriarch of Jerusalem convinces Balian to become the de facto king of Jerusalem. He says, I can't, because I've just made this treaty, with Salah ad-Din, agreed with him that I won't take up arms again. And he says that these don't count anymore because he's our enemy and everything else. And he still sends another dispatch to Salah ad-Din asking for permission if he can let the wife and the kids go. And not only does Salah ad-Din allow his wife and kids to leave, but he also furnishes them with gifts and clothes and fruits and food and so on. This was his character, and so and then there was a siege of Jerusalem, and Muslims had successes after a while. And then it came to pass that Balian realized that he has to make terms with Salah ad-Din, which he does, and the Crusaders are allowed to leave by paying a ransom fee, 10 dinars for men and 5 for women, and 2 for children. Many could not afford to pay, and so Salah ad-Din allowed them to leave free without paying. It was a reflection of his magnanimity, of his kindness and his mercy, as well. And Balian, of course, had threatened that if Salah ad-Din came in, then they would destroy the holy sites of the Muslims. And so therefore, to prevent this happening, he refused, and he made terms with the Crusaders. And then of course they left back to Europe, but he made terms with them. The whole beautiful point is this, that I want us to remember that Jerusalem is a landscape. It's a place of extreme importance for the Muslims as well, of course, for the Jews and for the Christians. But the Muslims have a beautiful historical precedent, and that is that whenever Muslims ruled that place, they dealt with the Christians and Jews with a lot of justice and mercy and kindness. When the Prophet's companion Omar radiallahu anhu captured Jerusalem, there were, of course, people living there. It was ruled by the Christians, This is a beautiful account of when he was being shown around the Church of the Holy Sepulchre by the Patriarch of Jerusalem. uh, you know, it came time for Salah, and so Umar said, "I have to pray," and the patriarch says, "You can pray right here in the church." And Umar says, "If I prayed in the church, then people would take this as a mosque after me, and I wouldn't want to do that." And so therefore he comes out, he throws a stone, and where the stone landed, that's where they built a mosque, which is now called Masjid Umar, which is yards away from Church of Holy Sepulchre today. um, he gave rights. Whenever the Christians took control, they always expelled the Jews, because Christians always disliked the Jews. They always expelled them. Even in Al-Andalus, in Islamic Spain, in 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad arrived in 711, the ones ruling Spain, of course, were the Visigothic Christians. And some of the early kings, like, Ricarid the First and Chintilla, you had the Fourth Council of Toledo, where they forced baptism of Jews and forced conversion of Jews and separated their kids from their parents. All terrible crimes happened. But when Muslims arrived, they gave the rights to the Jews, who let them live in safety and peace and build their synagogues and worship. So much so that even in Spain, in Al-Andalus, the Caliph Abdurrahman III of the 10th century, his diplomat, in fact, was Hasdai ibn Shaprut, who was a Jewish intellectual and politician who worked with Abdurrahman III. You might know that Sheikh Jarrah, which is where in East Jerusalem, where they've been expelling and evicting these Muslim Palestinian families, is named after Hussam ad-Din al-Jarrahi, who was Salah ad-Din's physician, right? And so his other physician was a man called Maimonides, who was a rabbi, who was the most famous rabbi in all of Jewish history, Yusuf ibn Mamun, who was Maimonides, and he in fact was Salah ad-Din's physician. He's called the second Moses, so celebrated, in Jewish literature. It's just showing an example, therefore, about the fact that Muslims, we treated the Jews and Christians, with a sense of justice, and kind of convivencia of living together, very much unlike what's happening now in Palestine, and I remember that Sheikh Jarrah is just a microcosm. It's a microcosm of the macrocosm that is apartheid, and a macrocosm that is settler colonialism, and a macrocosm that is the dehumanization of the Palestinians, and so on and so forth. And this has been going on for more than 70 years now. And I think that this is quite a watershed moment. That's what I feel, that there is a kind of a reawakening, in a sense, in the world globally, in understanding and really having a feel for the plight of the Palestinians, at this particular time. And of course, it's just gone on for far too long. And Gaza, of course, is another example, because of the bombardment that they face, and the fact that this is a country that lives under siege. The air is controlled, the water is controlled, the work permits are controlled, the land is controlled. All of this is a siege. In fact, it's the longest running siege in human history. And Palestine itself, more than 40% of the world's refugees today are Palestinians. It makes it the world's largest refugee crisis in the world. 6 million refugees since 1948, are Palestinians. And the world can no longer be silent to this great travesty, this great injustice committed against the Palestinian people, Muslims and Christians included. And so therefore, we have some lessons that we can take from the events of the Crusades. And I would also remind you, therefore, that when when Salah ad-Din recaptured al-Quds, and 1193 Salah ad-Din, he dies, it didn't always remain, again, in Muslim hands, because there were going to be new difficulties facing the Muslims. So the Ayyubid family didn't always do the best, in fact, with Jerusalem. And this was really reflected a lot in the accounts of Sibat ibn Jawzi, who was the grandson of the great scholar Ibn al-Jawzi. And he was outraged because, soon enough, not so long after Salah ad-Din dies, 793, Jerusalem was handed back to the Crusaders, handed back to the Christians by Al-Kamil. Al-Kamil was the son of Salah ad-Din's brother, Safaruddin. From 1229 to 1238, it remains in Christian hands. And so one of the great sultans, Malik Dawood, asked Sibat ibn Jawzi to raise his voice about what was happening and the betrayal about the great legacy of Salah ad-Din was now being betrayed by the other members of his family, Ayyubid family. The good ones amongst them were like Al-Mu'azzam Isa and Nasr Dawood himself, the ruler of Karak. They were good, and they were very much in opposition to this. And it kind of went back to the Ayyubid rule under Nasr Dawood, who was a good one, because of Ayyubid rivalries amongst the Ayyubids. And so it was then handed back to the Franks in 1243 for the second time again. The ones who really took up the great spirit of resistance, even perhaps more than even the Ayyubids, were in fact the Mamluks. In 1250, they showed a great sense of spirit, of renewal, of revival, of defeat of the Crusaders in a way that hadn't been seen before. Baybars, for example, the great Sultan, he takes back the coastline. And so Ascalon, which had not been captured since 1097, was now taken back, by the Muslims or armies of Baybars. And with the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf, the city of Acre was finally captured in 1291, and it was really a big occasion. In fact, it was described as, the Quran reciters came and the Hadith reciters came, and even they recited Sahih al-Bukhari as well, and they gave money to the poor, and it was a big occasion because finally the Crusaders had been expelled from the Muslim world. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that in this time that we're living in, that Allah protect the Muslimin of Bilad al-Sham, of Syria, of Palestine, of Gaza, of China, of Kashmir, of people suffering from all over the world. May Allah give them aid and assistance. May Allah unify the ranks of the Muslims. And remember, of course, division is our greatest tragedy. In many cases, one of the greatest tragedies. The Prophet said that tafarraq, division, is adab, it's punishment, and unity is rahmah, is mercy. We ask Allah unite the affairs of the Muslims wherever they are, and that Allah, free Palestine from the occupation they've been living under for so long, and Allah protect us all. Jazakumullah khairan.
The first question is, how accurate or trustworthy is the Pact of Umar?
Pact of Umar, there's two kind of accounts of the Pact of Umar. One of them is held not to be very trustworthy, but the other one is very trustworthy. The one that's currently stationed in the Masjid Umar, in fact not stationed, but it's displayed in the Masjid of Umar, is a true representation of Umar's pact. Now remember, of course, there were Christians at that time who did not want the Jews to resettle into Palestine. I mean, Christians, of course, always had these problems and pogroms against the Jews, but Umar al-Khattab did allow the Jews, to settle, in Jerusalem, with the Christians and with the Muslims, and so therefore, it's a true representation.
Okay, so the next question is, given there were many major Jewish scholars in high position under Saladin, like Rambam, I mean, he's referring to Musa ibn Maimun, did Jews play active part in fighting against Crusades, or are they exempted from taking part due to jizya?
Yeah, as far as I know, the Jews did not take part really there may have been one or two random examples, but they did not take part, with the Muslims in fighting the Crusaders. However, the Jews they saw the Crusades as a punishment, on the people, maybe a reflection of their sins, but they also saw the reconquest of Jerusalem as a blessing. And that's true not only in al-Quds, but also, like I mentioned, in Spain as well. In fact, this is this Jewish historian called Zain Zohar, who says that when the Muslims crossed the Straits of the Gibraltar and entered into Al-Andalus, the Jews welcomed them as liberators from Christian persecution. Therefore, there's always been this sense that the Jews have applauded the justice of the Muslims. And this is not, even if you look at contemporary history, like more or less in our not so long history like now. I mean, if you look at the Holocaust, for example, and the fact that many Muslims, did great works in rescuing the lives of the Jews in the Holocaust. Albania is a wonderful example. You have the Code of the Bisa of rescuing, countless number of Jews in the Holocaust. You have North Africa, another example. There's a very good book called Among the Righteous by Robert Satloff, where he counts many of these examples of Arabs saving Muslims in the Holocaust. You also have the Grand Mosque of Paris, the Imam of the Masjid of Paris, who hid the Jewish children, in the basement of the mosque, and so on and so forth. So therefore, it's not about Muslims don't dislike Jews for being Jews. It's more about the political entity of Zionism, which is about occupation and suppression of the native inhabitants of that land. I mean, that's the problem that we have.
Okay, we have two similar questions, so I will just read them together. As a Muslim, what is the best thing we can do for Palestine? And another brother asked, what initiatives should we take now after learning about the history?
So I think the first thing, of course, is to remember we need to be asking our Lord subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Prophet's most difficult moments, even on the day of Ta'if. If you look at his supplication, Allahumma ilayka ashku dha'fa quwwati wa qillati hilati wa hawani ala nas, or will I complain to you about the weakness of my strength, the lack of my resources, the fact that people don't take me seriously. He's asking Allah. So therefore, dua should never be undermined. The Prophet said dua is a weapon of the believer. But it does not stop in dua, because we also have to be proactive. I think that right now we have a lot that we can do. There are organizations that work in England. We have Friends of Aqsa, which is very quite active, in fact, on the ground in Al-Aqsa and helping the Muslims and so on and so forth, but also about trying to raise awareness about the injustices of the Israeli government. So we have boycott, divestment, and settlements, which is a very big campaign which should be promoted about boycotting. There's the other things about our own initiatives as communities to unify the ranks of the Muslims. Division, of course, is a punishment, and so often we become entangled in these divisions based upon small tangents, and that we can't see through or above them or beyond them, realizing, of course, that there is a bigger problem that we're facing at this moment in time, that we have to work together in these areas. So I think that each of us is responsible. If you're an imam, if you're a teacher or community leader, you're responsible in that respect, and of course, then the other thing would be use the power of the social media. Remember that Israel just bombed Gaza's media center, Al Jazeera and AAP, and they try to hide from the world the war crimes that they commit against innocent people. You have to use the media, use social media, use your Twitter accounts, your YouTube, Facebook, to enlighten the world about the crimes against the Palestinians, and also to give a sense of hope to the Palestinians that there's a concern, about what's happening to them. So I think there's a few different things that we can do, of course, and to petition, of course, are also important. And may Allah give them aid, and may Allah make us of those who can do whatever we can to alleviate them in their suffering.
Moving on to the next question, what do you think was the cause of decline of the Ayyubid family?
I think that when it's like when Jerusalem was taken, I think that it kind of in some ways the Ayyubid, the brothers, felt a sense of ease, because they felt that the bigger job has been done of recapturing Jerusalem, but now it was a matter of expansionism. It was self-aggrandizement and expansion and control, and these things became a big problem even in Spain, because it meant power, and everybody loves power, and remaining and keeping power at the expense of the greater needs of the ummah. That was the problem, and that's exactly what happened. Therefore, in Beit al-Maqdis, corruption, seeped in, lack of concern for Jerusalem. Even though they're building up these new centers of Syria and Egypt, which is good, but they became focal points because of their power, rather than Jerusalem, and therefore it was neglected. Until then, of course, the new rulers of the Mamluks came and then destroyed and defeated them, the Crusaders. It's a bit like when Yusuf ibn Tashufin came from the Maghreb back into Al-Andalus, and he's trying to fight back against the Christians, but he also then defeating the small Muluk of Tawaif, because he realized that it's just so pathetic in their division that there has to be a way of re-inspiring a new sense of unity, in the Muslims. And we ask Allah, for the same in our time. I'm going to have to leave now, inshallah, if that's okay.
Can we just take one or two questions more? It will take only 1 or 2 minutes, I think.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Okay, the next question is there a possibility of the rise of a modern day Salahuddin and how?
Yeah, my student has just arrived, in fact, right now, so I need to answer the door. Well, we should have hope, of course. I mean, remember that, Salahuddin was not perfect. I mean, he was, in fact, we should not think about like utopia, but the idea is that we would want, rulers that would take on the responsibility of the Muslim Ummah, that have the concern of liberating lands of like occupation, like in Palestine, and not to establish hegemony in those areas, but to establish justice between all people, including, of course, Jews and Christians. I mean, that's the hope, that all can live together with a sense of the goodness of Islamic justice. I mean, we have, of course, a model for that, and so and there is going to be, of course, change. I mean, that's oppression, tyranny can't survive forever. The occupation can't last forever. Everything has an end point. Allah in the Quran says, وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامِ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. These are days that we alter between the people, and so therefore we ask whatever is yet to come ahead of us to be much better than what the Palestinians have suffered from for the last 70 years. Jazakumullah khairan.